Hello guys, welcome to my channel. Welcome to another video. This is the last part of the remaining chapter. Disclaimer: none of the event mentioned are true. No adults being harmed in the video. Don't have any adult negative role. For a long moment, he simply stared at the little boy holding out the flower as though it were treasure. Then, with a faint exhale, he reached out and accepted it. "Thank you," he murmured. His voice was low, hesitant, but the corners of his lips softened in the faintest smile. Jimin froze in the doorway, her breath caught in her chest. Her heart clenched painfully at the sight. The smallest crack in Jungkook's armor, a glimpse of warmth she had longed for. She pressed a hand against her mouth to stop the sob that threatened to escape. Minho giggled, delighted, and threw his arm around Jungkook's neck. For a second, Jungkook sniffed, stiffened, but then, shockingly, he let the embrace linger. That image seared into Jim's soul. It was fragile, fleeting, but it was enough to make her whisper to the night later, as she watched her son sleep beside her. A word she had created for herself is hope. No strong, no certain, but just enough to keep her alive. The fragile hope that Jimin nurtured in her heart was like a candle flame, small, trembling, yet enough to pierce the shadows. But fate, it seemed, had a cruel habit of blowing on that flame just when it dared to burn brighter. The next evening, the house was busier than usual. Servants scared and fro, arranging fresh flowers in tall vases, polishing silver strays, and setting the dining hall with far more than usual. Jimmy's chest tightened and uneasy as she watched the preparations. She wasn't told that occasion demanded such fuss, and she didn't dare ask. When the front doors opened, the answers walked in. She was younger than Yuna, softer in her beauty, but there was a striking resemblance to Jungkook in the sharp line of her jaw and the confident lift of her chin. Her presence was immediate. She walked as though the world was meant to welcome her. Jisso, Jungkook's mother exclaimed with genuine delight, rushing forward to embrace her. "Finally, my dear niece is here." "Niece?" The word echoed in Jimin's mind. Jeon Jisoo smiled warmly, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "It's been far too long, Auntie. I thought you would forgotten me." "Forgotten you? Never. You belong here," Mrs. John said, her voice thick with pride. She turned toward Jungkook, who had appeared from his study, his steps slowing as his gaze landed on the newcomer. Jisoo's face lit up. "Oppa!" she cried, rushing toward him. Without hesitation, she flung her arms around him in a tight hug. Jimin's breath caught. She stood in the hallway, clutching the edge of a laundry basket, watching as Jungkook, usually unreadable expression softened, genuinely softened, for the first time in what felt like forever. "Jisoo," he said, his voice low, but carrying a warmth that struck Jimin like a blow. "You have grown." "Don't say that," she laughed, pulling back, but keeping her hand linked with his. "I'm still the same girl who followed you everywhere." Their closeness was undeniable. natural in a way that came from years of shared memories. Mrs. John approving gaze flickered between them, glowing with satisfaction. Note that Jisso is back from abroad. Everything feels complete, she declared. This house was too quiet without her. Her eyes darted briefly to Jimin, sharp and dismissive, as if to remind her she was nothing more than an outsider occupying space. Jimin lowered her gaze quickly, her throat burning. At dinner, Jisoo became the sun around which everyone else orbited. Her stories filled the room, of her years overseas, of her successes, of the people she had met. She teased him affectionately, calling Oppa with a familiarity that made Jimin's stomach twist. She didn't protest, if anything. His lips curved faintly, as though he welcomed it. Jimin sat silently at the far end again, cutting food for Minho, swelling past the lump in her throat. Every laugh Jisoo drew from Jungkook felt like another thread unwinding inside her chest. Minho, innocent eyes as always fragile, broke the fragile mask she tried to wear. He leaned close and whispered, Oma, who is she? Appa looks happy. Will she stay here? The question made her freeze. She didn't know the answer, and the thought terrified her. Later that night, she passed by the library and heard laughter. Peeking, she saw Jungkook and Jisoo sitting together, a photo album spread open between them. Remember this? Jisoo said, pointing to a picture. You carried me on your shoulder the whole day. You always protected me, Oppa. Jungkook chuckled softly. You were a handful, but I was your handful, she teased, leaning closer. Jimin's heart clenched so tightly she had to press a hand against her chest. She slipped away silently before they could notice her, tears burning in her eyes. Back in her room, she sank to the floor beside Minho's sleeping form. The words clawed out of her in a whisper, raw and broken. Why does it always have to be someone else? Why can't it ever be me? She had given everything, her silence, her obedience, her patience, her love. Yet, one after another, faces from Jungkook past or family appeared to push her further into the shadows. First Yuna, now Jisoo, each one more accepted, more welcomed, more deserving in the eyes of this world. The flame of hope flickered dangerously, and still she clung to it because of Minho. Because sometimes when Jungkook gaze lingered a fraction too long, she believed, just maybe, Jungkook had never been a man to bow to his own hurt easily. Pride had been stitched into his veins since the day he was born, raised with the weight of legacy and expectation, groomed into a life where every choice had to echo strength, not vulnerability. And so, when he found himself staring at Jimin one last evening, the quiet of the room thick and unsaid words, the thought that kept circling in his chest was not love, not devotion, but an unbearable tug of inevitability. Like fate was dragging him by the collar toward a door he did not want to open, and yet knew he could no longer avoid. The proposal had formed in his thought days before he gave it shape, lingering like a poison he had been too afraid to swallow or spit out. And when it finally came, it was not wrapped in romance, nor carried by tenderness, but rather thrust out like a blade offered in defense. Marry me, he said flatly, his tone more commanding than plea, his eyes avoiding her as though the weight of seeing her reaction would strip him of the last armor he carried. And Jimin froze, the words crashing into her chest with the force of the both dream and curse. For years she had built castles of hope in the quiet space of her mind, imagining his mind reacting for hers in gentleness, imagining vows spoken under canopy of sincerity, but when she hearing now felt nothing like the fate that she had tried to cuddle in secret, her lips parted soundlessly, her finger twisting in the hem of her shirt. Why? And the world trembled like a child's cry, because she needed to know if there were even a fragment of affection hidden behind his stiff posture. But Jungkook's jaw tightened, his pride forcing the truth into a case, and he replied, because it's the only way, offering no explanation, only the stark command of a man who had been cornered by responsibility, by family pressure, by emotions he could not name without burning. And Jimmy's heart ached at the cruelty of it, because in his voice she found no romance, only chance. And yet she could not stop the flicker of warmth that sparked inside her chest, the tiny whisper of, "At least he wants me." Even if not the way I dreamed, she nodded, her voice breaking as she said, "Okay." And in that moment she sealed her fate, half with gratitude and half with despair. Because this was what she had wanted for so long, to be this. Yet not like this, not as a duty wrapped in pride. And the days that followed blurred in a haze of hurled arrangements. His mother's sharp approval, the family's stern glances, and Jungkook's silence heavy as stone. The wedding was not a fairy tale, not the shimmering dream every girl whispered about. It was grand, yes, dropping in luxury, filled with the finest silks, the scent of roses pressed into every corner, chandeliers scattering light across polished marble. But to Jimin, all felt like an elaborate stage play, where she was merely an actress, reciting lines she had not written. She wrote for the gown his mother chose. Face carved in stone, not a flicker of tenderness, but betraying the storm she prayed existing him. Inside him, he looked like a man attending a business meeting, not his own wedding, and when his eyes finally met hers across the aisle, she swore for her heartbeat. She saw something soften, fear, maybe, or longing. But then it was gone, shattered away behind the steel of his pride. She walked toward him anyway. Every step both dream and curse, because the world whispered that she was lucky, that she was chosen, that she belonged now to a man every heart enveloped. Yet inside her the hollowness spread like a crack across glass, and when they stood side by side, hands linked only because tradition demanded it, she wanted to cry, to scream, to beg him to see her, not just as a convenient solution to family pressure, not just as the mother of a child he refused to acknowledge fully, but as a woman who loved him and every fragile piece of her soul. The vows were spoken, but when they were hollow echoes, Jungkook's voice steady, cold, like reciting a promise he had memorized rather than felt. While Jimin's voice wavered, betraying the storm within each word a prayer that someday the lines would come alive, the meaning. And the officiant fairy tale magic, only the heavy weight of chains closing around her wrist, golden and glittered, but chains nonetheless. She looked at Jungkook, waiting for something, perhaps a smile. A smile that could give him some hope, perhaps the squeeze of his hand that he will just take it. But it was all just a hope. She was hoping. She was hoping that perhaps anything to convince her that this was union was not entirely empty. But he turned his head towards the crowd instead, bowing politely, his expression betraying nothing, and Jimmy's heart shattered quietly behind her painted smile. The reception blurred around her, music and laughter swirling in colors that did not reach her. Yuna was there, offering Jungkook warm congratulations, her gaze sharp with a mixture of envy and resignation, and Jisoo too, clinging to his arm with familial affection. Their bond so natural it twisted Jimin's stomach with insecurity. Every woman in the room looked at her with curiosity, some with admiration, some with jealousy, whispering about how she had captured Jungkook's hand, but none of them saw the truth that she had captured his heart. She endured it all with a smile, Minhu's small hand clenched in her, his innocent eyes shining with delight, and the spectator believing it all to be a storybook dream, too young to understand the current pain underneath. It was his joy that crept. Jimin was collapsing, his laughter as he tugged at her dress, begging for cake, reminding her that at least this marriage meant security for him. A father named to protect him, even if love remained an unspoken ghost haunting the edges of their new lives. When the guests finally left and the night fell out, the weight of reality pressed down heavier than ever. Their wedding night was not painted in passion, not draped in tender whispers, but wrapped in silence thick enough to choke. Jungkook stood by the window, back to her, losing his tie with a sigh, and Jimin sat at the edge of the bed, her fingers knotting tightly into her lap, her chest etching with words she dared not speak. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, while he slept on the far side, their bodies inches apart, but words away. And she whispered into darkness. It felt like a dream, but also curse, her voice too faint for him to hear, though perhaps some part of him did, for he shifted in his sleep, his hand brushing her briefly before pulling back, a fleeting touch that left her heart aching for more. The marriage that should have been the beginning of something beautiful felt instead like the tightening of invisible chains around Jimin's chest. And though she had dreamed for so long of being with Jungkook when the vows were spoken and the rings exchanged under the eyes of families and whispers of tradition, she could already feel the cracks forming in the cage she had willingly stepped into because Jungkook did not look at her the way her husband should. His eyes cold, his demeanor distant, his tone carrying more duty than affection, as though he had done nothing more than a check of a responsibility written somewhere in the book of fate. And Jimin, with her delicate hope and trembling heart, told herself that love sometimes grew after marriage, that closeness could come later, that maybe if she tried hard enough, he would one day look at her not as a burden, but as a woman he could cherish. Yet the days slipped into nights, and the nights into more silences, and she found her sleeping beside a man who turned his back to her, who avoided her touch as if her presence was a reminder of chains he never asked for, leaving her clutching the sheets with silent tears that she wiped quickly lest anyone notice, especially Minhu, the little boy who called her Mama with a voice pure that pierced through her loneliness like a ray of light through dark storm clouds. And perhaps it was that innocent child laughter and curiosity that kept her breathing, that made her put on one foot in front of the other despite the emptiness in her marriage bed. Jungkook, for his part, behaved as though he had done enough simply by marrying her, by allowing her and Minhu under his roof, and though he shielded her from outright disgrace in society by giving her his name. He kept his heart locked away, his words measured, his gaze often elsewhere, and in moments when their eyes met across the dinner table or in the hallways of the vast house, Jimin would search for even the smallest flicker of warmth, something to cling to, but he stared past over her as if she were another piece of furniture, as if she were there but only truly seen, and the edge of invisibility buried deeper each day until it felt like her soul itself was bruised. She told herself to endure. She told herself she had endured wars. That an orphan and single mother, she had fought through hunger, humiliation, and countless lonely nights. But something about being unloved in the very space that was supposed to be the sanctuary hollowed her out in a way poverty never had. Because there she had everything except the one thing her heart craved: acceptance, tenderness, love. And when she looked at him in who adored Jungkook with the wide, innocent eyes only a child could possess, calling him Dada with unshakable certainty, she realized that it was her own son who kept weaving fragile threads between her and the man who kept pulling away. Men who clever in the way children are, sent the cold wall between his mom and dada, and in the little ways he tried to break it, dragging Jungkook to sit beside Jimin, pushing both their hands together under the pretense of a game, babbling everything, babbling about how dada should smile more with mama. Out the faintest, almost reluctant chuckle at his antics, a sound that made Jimin heart squeeze, because it was proof that there was softness somewhere inside him, buried under the pride and fear, but it always vanished quickly, swallowed by silence or distracted by the very watchful eyes of his family, who had never welcomed Jimin fully, who looked at her as though she had tricked their golden son into chains. The cage of this marriage grew tighter each day, the crack becoming more visible as the reality of her position pressed to smile through the hollowness so that Minhu would not notice the emptiness in her eyes. She felt herself slowly suffocating, trapped in the loveless union that was beginning to consume the very girl who once dreamed of love as if it were sunlight she could reach for. Yet, even as she tried to breathe inside the suffocating silence, Jimin could not fully abandon the fragile seed of hope that lived inside her. That small, desperate voice whispering, maybe tomorrow, maybe the next day he will soften, maybe he will see me. And so she endured his distance with a resilience that surprised even herself, convincing her heart not to collapse every time he left the room without a glance, every time his footstep echoed down the hallway without pausing by her side, every time his words were clipped and formal, as though she were nothing more than someone bound to him by obligation. A presence who could neither erase nor embrace, and the loneliness she carried began to settle in her bones. The loneliness she endured for about years and now settled down more than that. Like a quiet illness that no one could diagnose, but Minho, sweet Minho, became both her cure and her torment. Because in his innocent eyes there was no crack, no distance, no cage, only love. And he believed so fiercely in the bond between his mama and his dada that he threw himself wholeheartedly into stitching together the pieces his tiny hands could barely grasp, calling Jungkook to join them to meal, tugging at his sleeve when he tried to leave the table, insisting that the three of them should take walks in the garden together, and sometimes Jungkook would comply, though his expression remained unreadable, and Jimin walking beside him with her son. skipping between them, would dare to let herself imagine for a fleeting second that this was their family was meant to feel like. That if she closed her eyes, she could almost pretend that she could loved. But then she opened them and found Jungkook's gaze wandering away, his steps slowing as though he witnessed to cut the walk short. The dream would collapse and leave behind only a sharper edge, as though the brief glimpse of what could be was crueler than never knowing it at all. Nights were the hardest, for when the house was quiet and Minho had fallen asleep, curled against her chest, Jimin would lie awake beside the man who turned his back to her, his body rigid, as though afraid she might reach out, and she would whisper to herself that she should be grateful that at least she was under a roof, that at least her son had a father to figure to look out, but gratitude could not silence the hollow echo in her chest. The echo of a man caged in the marriage that felt more like exile than belonging, and she wondered if Jungkook ever heard it too. Even in the stillness of night, he could sense the way her heart bled beside him. Slowly, the cracks in her cage deepened, and though she hid from behind beautiful smiles, behind obedience, behind the quiet strength that had carried her through years of hardship, she knew something inside her was beginning to fracture beyond repair. And when she caught, thank you so much for watching. Hope you guys like the video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. And this was the last part of the video. Bye. See you soon.